Hello, and welcome back to the Validity Podcast. I'm your host, Valentina Rodriguez, and I know last week we didn't have an episode. It's been pretty crazy with Hurricane Milton hitting Florida and specifically coming really close to Tampa, and the evacuations, and just like class was canceled for like over a week. So lecture we didn't have, and then we had like exams during the time that class was canceled. So it's been like a while since I've like sat in the classroom and really like took in new material. But this past week I did attend my neuromuscular physiology class. It was like optional to attend in person or attend virtually. I attended in person and there were only a couple other students there. So it was very much of an intimate little discussion, but I think it's a really interesting topic that I'm excited to get into. It's essentially protein intake and exercise to offset sarcopenia. And what sarcopenia is the gradual and inevitable skeletal muscle mass loss that you experience with aging. And before I get into the science, I just want to give you guys some personal updates, but I don't have a ton. I'm still reversing. I'm still getting my food up. I dropped a full day of eating on my YouTube channel. I am deep in PhD applications. Like I'm submitting probably the actual applications within the next 3 weeks max, because they're due the 1st of December, and I kind of probably want to get them in early so that I can go home for Thanksgiving and not have to worry about those applications. So I'm deep into that. I have more calls with PhD advisors. I'm really excited to see how that application process ends up turning out. And I'm excited to see where I end up getting interviews so that I can visit the different campuses, like actually speak to the different professors in person. I've spoken to a lot of them virtually, but I think that it's going to be a really great experience to get to see where the potential campus is, the potential city that I'm moving to. Because like, it's really crazy. In a year, I don't know where I'll be living. Like I have a handful of different cities that I'm considering, obviously, because that's where like the PhD programs I'm applying to, where they're located. That's like my little handful of possibilities of where I'll be, but I don't know where exactly I'll end up. So I'm very excited just to kind of allow this entire application process to come to fruition, see where I end up getting interviews, visit the campuses, talk to the different researchers, and just see where I fit and where I'm going to next. And I'm really excited because I'll still be here. I graduate in December. So I graduate in literally less than 2 months, which is insane. And I will still be here the entire spring semester. So that's my biggest personal update. But other than that, we're still recruiting for the world's first reverse dieting study. So if you're interested in being a participant, email reversedietstudy@gmail.com for eligibility forms and more information. So other than that, we're literally going to get straight into the science. I do think today's episode will be a little bit on the shorter side, but it's probably a good thing because I feel like I have been yapping y'all's ears off with a bunch of technical stuff. And today we're finally back to not a super technical episode. So I think that you guys are going to be able to derive a lot of value from this, especially if you're a little bit older, especially if you're maybe like perimenopausal, going into menopause, reaching that kind of age. If you have parents, if you work with older clients, I think this is really going to benefit you. So like I said, sarcopenia is this inevitable and gradual skeletal muscle mass loss that we see with aging. When we think about sarcopenia and we think about successful aging, we don't think about preventing this loss of muscle mass, but we think about offsetting it. We think about diminishing the rate at which we lose that muscle mass. Because like I said, it is inevitable, but there's a lot of things and practices that you can implement in order to not make it as severe or as drastic. So there's something called the catabolic crisis model. And this is just a model that shows a decline in skeletal muscle mass, a decline in skeletal muscle function, and an incline or an increase, gradual increase in injury as you age. And this catabolic crisis model has a lower endpoint than a traditional model, basically saying because you're losing muscle mass and that skeletal muscle function is declining, you're further increasing your risk of injury. So it's actually almost like a compounded effect as you get older that these things are declining and your risk of injury is increasing. So when we think about regional distribution of where we're actually losing muscle mass from as we age, Abe et al. In 2014 reported that there's a greater mass loss in your lower limbs than in upper limbs. And this is seen across studies. This is seen across individuals. Like we don't know why, and it's unclear the reason. Maybe it's because you carry more skeletal muscle mass in your lower limbs, so you have more mass to lose. But it's still, whether we know why or not, it doesn't change the fact that we do see a greater decrease in muscle mass in your legs, specifically in your quads. So you see more muscle mass loss in your quads than in your hamstrings. You see more in your overall legs than in your arms. And it could be just detraining. It could be a greater loss of motor unit recruitment in your legs than in your arms. It could be lower physical activity. You're sitting more, like legs were used to just like being up and walking and being almost trained just via walking, and then you're detraining them to a greater extent by sitting and becoming more idle, potentially. I don't know. When it comes to the specific fiber type that you lose as you age, it used to be thought that you have a selective loss of type 2 fibers, which are the fast twitch. They're the ones that are more responsible for more explosive movements, sprinting. They're more glycolytic. But a research led by Dr. Lexel found that there's actually similar decreases in type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. So it's actually now debunked that it's only like type 2 preferentially being lost as you age. It's actually both, and you decrease both the size of those fibers and the number of those fibers. So it's really not looking fantastic if you don't do anything to mitigate or to try to attenuate the skeletal muscle mass loss that you will inevitably see as you age. It's not looking good. So evidence from cross-sectional area studies and EMG studies show that motor units remain constant until about age 60. But from age 60 to 80, you get a 50% decline. So it comes pretty fucking rapidly. And there are practices, like I said, that you can implement to try to attenuate this rapid decline. You can't prevent it altogether, but I think that you should try to mitigate it to the extent that you can. So let's talk about that. So there's kind of two parts to this. It's protein intake to mitigate or attenuate the skeletal muscle mass loss with aging, and kind of just how your body responds to protein differently as you age. And then also exercise resistance training and how your body responds differently to exercise and resistance training as you age. So starting with protein, you have something called post-absorptive muscle protein synthesis. You guys know we've talked about muscle protein synthesis like a gajillion times. I'm going to refer to it as MPS in the rest of the episode. But post-absorptive MPS is essentially your upregulation of muscle protein synthesis after you eat. So typically you get an upregulation after you eat because you eat, you get an increase in plasma or blood amino acid levels. Those amino acids get taken up into your skeletal muscle cell, and that increase in intramuscular amino acid levels is in of itself a stimulus to increase muscle protein synthesis. But as you age, you get reduced post-absorptive increases in muscle protein synthesis. And what's interesting is that recent studies actually don't show that you have reduced basal levels of MPS. So your baseline muscle protein synthesis, whatever rate you kind of have at baseline at homeostasis before you eat, without training, like just like your baseline MPS rates, those don't really change as you age. But typically when you're younger, you have that baseline, you consume a meal, that MPS increases a lot. When you age, yeah, your baseline isn't changing much, but then you eat a meal and your MPS is not going to increase nearly as much as it did when you were younger. And this can be related to health status, physical activity levels, or even the sensitivity of the tests that are being done to test for the muscle protein synthesis rates. But essentially, in a nutshell, when you eat protein, young people respond better to eating protein than old people. And there's a very consistent observation in this insensitivity of the elderly to muscle protein stimulation by amino acids in the blood. So like I said, you consume a meal, amino acids go through your GI tract. Some of those amino acids are taken up by your liver. So that's hepatic extraction, because your liver and all your GI organs also need amino acids for them to continue functioning. So hepatic extraction will kind of take away what those organs need, and then whatever's left will be circulating in your blood, available to be uptaken by skeletal muscle. So typically when you get this increase of amino acids in your blood, that increases the skeletal muscle uptake, and that increases muscle protein synthesis. So typically increases in your blood amino acid levels equals increases in muscle protein synthesis. But it seems to be that as we age, the elderly have an insensitivity to respond to increases of amino acids in the blood. And it could be due to protein digestion or absorption kinetics. So it could be that less amino acids are actually making it to the bloodstream as we age, meaning there's greater hepatic extraction. So when you consume protein, it could be that the older you get, the more that is being kind of taken by the liver, by the GI organs, and the less that is actually making it out to your blood. There was a study done in 2013 that basically looked at resistance training without protein or without amino acids, and resistance training with protein with amino acids in both young and old. So if you took a young person and you just had them train and not consume any amino acids, not consume any protein, they still increase their MPS. If you gave an old person put them through resistance training, did not give them protein, did not give them amino acids, they did not have increases in their MPS. So it's kind of saying when you're young, you can train and still increase MPS with or without protein. So whether you train with protein or you train without protein, you're getting that increase in your muscle protein synthesis. But when you're old, the only time that they saw in the elderly population in the specific study, the only time they saw increases in muscle protein synthesis was when they trained and they consumed essential amino acids, so protein. And when we talk about why there might be less amino acids making it to the blood, why the elderly are less responsive to amino acids and to increasing their muscle protein synthesis, there was a study that found you may be limited by that hepatic extraction of amino acids. And so because there might be a greater hepatic extraction of amino acids as you age, you might need to increase the frequency of your protein consumption as you get older to maximize amino acid serum levels. And not only do you need to eat more frequently, but you also need to increase the amount that you're eating. So there's a study saying that because of this increased hepatic first pass uptake of amino acids, limiting your ability to upregulate your muscle protein synthesis, you might want to increase the frequency of your protein intake in order to almost get like a continuous increase of amino acids in your blood. But also there's studies that find that the elderly just require more protein. I know you probably think about your grandparents, like they'll see you drinking like a protein shake and it's like, oh, I don't need all that. You're young, you're building your muscles. Like, I don't need all that. I'm good with just like my little 3 meals. Actually, it's the opposite. Like they need it more than you do. And that's kind of like a weird, in my opinion, unexpected thing that most people don't know is that the older you are, the more protein that you actually require. Protein is not a thing that only young bodybuilding meathead type vibes, like whatever the grandparents want to tell you, they see you eating protein and they think they don't need all that. They do, and they need it more than you. So there was a study that looked at muscle protein synthesis increases after different protein intakes. And what they found was that in the older group, 40 grams of protein was superior to 20 grams of protein in increasing MPS rates. But in the younger group, 40 grams of protein was not better than 20 grams of protein at increasing muscle protein synthesis rates. It was maximized at both intakes. So whether the young people consumed 20 grams of protein or 40 grams of protein, they were maximally stimulating MPS. But in the older group, they actually needed 40 grams of protein to further increase MPS, and 20 grams was not sufficient. So not only might we need more protein as we get older, we might need literally double the amount of protein that you used to consume or that you think you should be consuming when you get older. So that's pretty much the most important parts of protein feeding. And the biggest takeaway from all of that is to say is as you get older, in order to offset the inevitable skeletal muscle mass loss that you're going to see with aging, you do that by trying to upregulate your muscle protein synthesis to the greatest extent that you can. But that muscle protein synthesis is almost resistant to responding to the things that would normally increase it. And therefore, you need to not only increase the frequency of protein intake as you get older, you actually also need to increase the amount of protein as you get older. So as you get older, 40 grams of protein maybe 3 to 4 hours apart is going to be really valuable to offsetting this sarcopenia that we experience as we age. Another thing we can do to combat age-induced muscle loss essentially is obviously through exercise. So protein intake is one of the methods, exercise is the other. And exercise stands alone as one of the most effective interventions of promoting lean mass accretion and retention and enhancing muscle function as you age. Because we know aging is associated with differences in muscle protein synthesis responses to resistance training and to endurance training. That study where I told you they had a young group and an older group, and they did either training by itself or training with protein, you saw that the older group did not increase MPS in response to training alone. They needed training and protein. So you see that there's not only differences in how you respond to protein, there's also differences in how you respond to training as you age. There's a researcher, Kumar et al., who reported a blunting of muscle protein synthesis and mTOR signaling in the elderly compared to the young group that they were studying. However, they found that a doubling of resistance training volume, so from 3 sets to 6 working sets, substantially increased MPS rates in the elderly, but not in the young. However, it did not increase it in the young because in the young, 3 sets was sufficient to maximize muscle protein synthesis. So the elderly needed to do 6 sets to get the same response in muscle protein synthesis rates to training that the young group did when they did only 3 sets. So let's say this is where, oh, you guys can't see if you're listening on Spotify, but my hand is here. It's by my head. Say this is how you maximize muscle protein synthesis rates. The young group did 3 working sets and was able to get to that level. And in order to get to that level of muscle protein synthesis rates, the older group had to do 6 working sets. So not only are we seeing that as you get older, you might need to double your protein intake, we actually are saying that you might need to double your resistance training volume, which is backwards to what most people think. Most people think as you get older, I don't need to train that hard. I'm not a bodybuilder. I don't need to train as hard as those young kids, and I don't need to eat as much protein or whatever. Actually, you need to eat double as much protein as they do, and you need to train double as much as they do. And we talked about this a little bit in terms of, is this almost like going to deter older people from exercising and from eating protein if they think it's like, oh my God, I have to do all that. It's too much. It's not worth it. The way I see it is I don't think it should deter anybody from participating in an increased protein intake and from an increased resistance training volume. I think if anything, it really highlights the importance. I think as you get older, you maybe inevitably put less stress on how much protein you're eating, inevitably loosen up your resistance training habits. Like we're talking older, like past midlife, you know? So I think inevitably those habits will dwindle. And I think this messaging is just really, really reiterating, you cannot let those dwindle. Not only can you not let those dwindle, you actually kind of have to try to be intentional about doing even more than you did before. And maybe you won't be doubling your protein intake, and maybe you won't be doubling your resistance training volume, but just being intentional about trying to do more than you think you should be is going to still do more for you in attenuating sarcopenia than just letting those habits, your protein intake and your resistance training, dwindle on its own as you age. The last thing that we talked about was just kind of insulin responses as you get older. And what we actually find is that the older you get, the less sensitive you are to the anti-proteolytic effects of insulin. And what this means is insulin is inherently anti-catabolic. It helps promote keeping your muscle, and it prevents muscle breakdown. And it is found that as you get older, you're less responsive to insulin's actions of preventing muscle breakdown. So one of the ways in which this was studied was that it might not be necessarily that you're not responding to the insulin. It actually might be that you have a decrease in insulin-mediated vasodilation, which is just an opening of your blood vessels. And because you have less opening of your blood vessels, you're responding less as well. And so anything that can increase vasodilation can resensitize you to insulin's effects as you get older. And the way that you might be able to promote that is by doing cardio and doing aerobic exercise that would increase capillarization and increase blood flow. Anything with vasodilation would also promote your ability to respond to insulin as you get older, because it's thought to be that the reason you don't respond to insulin as you get older is because of a decrease in this insulin-mediated vasodilation. So if you can kind of bypass that and get other ways to increase your perfusion and your blood flow via capillarization, through aerobic exercise, through cardio, through endurance training, you might be able to resensitize yourself back to insulin's anti-proteolytic effects. I hope that makes sense. And the last thing that we really talked about is just exercises to combat this atrophy, and resistance training is the most potent to combat. And that's kind of the entire episode, honestly. We're thinking about we're getting older, and there's kind of a host of different things that are happening as we're getting older. So as we get older, we see that you don't respond the same to consuming protein, and you actually need more frequent protein intake and double your protein intake, essentially. You also need to double your resistance training volume in order to respond the way that you used to when it comes to muscle protein synthesis responses. And you also need to potentially couple cardio or aerobic training with your resistance training in order to resensitize yourself to the anti-proteolytic effects of insulin. So increased perfusion and blood flow will allow for you to respond to that insulin better. So the biggest thing is eat protein, eat it frequently, and eat more of it than you think you should. Resistance train, but also couple that with cardio. And you should be able to combat or attenuate age-related sarcopenia, age-related skeletal muscle mass loss, age-related decreases in muscle function, just kind of everything that you don't want to occur as you get older. You can combat all of those through protein resistance training and aerobic training. And it doesn't have to be like you're running marathons. It doesn't have to be like you're doing crazy high intensity like burpees. You could go for a bike ride. You could just get your steps in. The study that actually found increased capillarization and increased responses to resistance training through cardio just did it via an increase in step count. That was a different study from a different lecture, but we were able to connect the dots there. And yeah, so my recommendation would be increase your step count to increase your capillarization, perfusion, and blood flow. That will help you respond better to insulin, increase your protein intake frequency, and increase your resistance training volume in order to combat age-related sarcopenia and muscle mass loss. So that's what I got for you guys. Let me know if you have any questions. I am really excited to get into more like age-related content, especially surrounding menopause, but that's a whole can of worms that will open up as soon as we have honestly just more data on it, and as soon as I do more research on it, because there's not a ton out there, but it is a very, very necessary space to fill with evidence-based practices. So I hope you guys have an amazing rest of your day. As always, if you have any questions, you can email me or DM me at any of my socials linked in the description below. If you are interested in being a participant in the world's first reverse dieting study, then email reversedietstudy@gmail.com. And with that, I will see you in the next episode.